let's see if, the last thing I wanted to mention was this pepper spray device. So I have a picture for that too. Let me put this up. This is very unfortunate. So here's an image. What's that look like to all of you? Looks to me like a gun, like a fairly poor quality kind of Glock knockoff type of thing, right? Polymer. This one happens to be brightly colored, but they sell them in all different colors, including just black, in which case it just looks like a inexpensive polymer type pistol, 9mm pistol. This is, in fact, a pepper spray device. So it doesn't fire rounds. It does take a magazine, but apparently the magazine is full of OC. It's got a thumb safety. It's got a trigger. I mean, it looks just like a gun, but when you press the trigger, I presume that it's OC spray that comes out. It's hard to think of a worse idea than this contraption for a number of reasons. But one of the most common is other people are allowed to respond to your apparent use or threat of force. So when someone else is attempting to justify their use of force against you, it's not necessary that you are actually a threat of any particular degree. It only matters that you reasonably appeared to be a threat. So let's flip it around and just imagine that, for example, you're walking down the street, someone jumps out of a doorway, points a gun at you, says, "Give me your money." And you decide, well, I've prepared for this day. You step off the X, draw your own gun, shoot them dead. And then it turns out that their gun was actually a toy, a replica, something that was not, in fact, actually capable of inflicting death or serious bodily injury upon you. So you thought you were using deadly defensive force against an unlawful, imminent, deadly force threat. But you weren't. You were mistaken about that. The threat against you was not, in fact, deadly. Does that diminish your justification for your use of force? And the answer is no, it does not. So long as the threat you were defending against was a reasonable appearance of a deadly force threat. It doesn't have to be an actual threat. It has to be a reasonably perceived deadly force threat. Well, imagine that you're facing some kind of non-deadly force threat, a kind of, who knows, a road rage incident. You pull in a parking lot, car screeches up next to you, guy jumps out, says you cut him off back down the road, and he gets out of his car, you're out of your car, and he shoves you. All right, well, that's a simple battery. That's a crime, misdemeanor crime, non-deadly force, but an unlawful use of force. He's not allowed to shove you. You're entitled, you're privileged to defend yourself against that conduct with non-deadly force, non-deadly defensive force. That's what that element of proportionality means. Your defensive force has to be proportional to the threat. If the threat facing you is only non-deadly in nature, you can only use non-deadly force in self-defense. What if you responded to that shove by pulling out a real gun? Well, then what you've actually done is you've escalated what was a non-deadly force fight to a deadly force fight, and you've done it unlawfully because you're not lawfully privileged to respond to a non-deadly force fight with deadly force self-defense. You've gone to excessive force, disproportional force. You've lost that element of proportionality, which means you've lost self-defense. You cannot justify your use of that gun as lawful self-defense because you weren't using that deadly defensive force against a deadly force threat. You were facing merely a non-deadly force threat. So you say, all right, well, now that I know that, I certainly won't do that, right? I won't go to my gun. You know what I'll do instead, though, is I'll whip out this thing. I'll whip out, let's see if I can point to it. Yep. I'll whip out this thing because it's not deadly force, right? It's only a OC spray device. So I'd only actually be using non-deadly force against that shove, which I'm allowed to use non-deadly force to stop a non-deadly force threat. Here's the problem. You didn't just take out a typical OC canister. You didn't take out like a Saber Red canister, the kind I tend to carry myself, which just looks like nothing but an OC canister. Certainly does not resemble a handgun. I think we would all agree. If you had just pulled that out, it would have been obvious to everyone you were just using pepper spray to defend yourself. You were using non-deadly force to stop a non-deadly force attack. But if you pulled this thing out, in your head, subjectively, you know you're using only non-deadly force, but everyone around you is going to perceive that you pulled out what? That you pulled out an actual gun, because it looks exactly like an actual gun. And all those other people are privileged to use their own defensive force against the appearance of your threat. And what it looks like is you escalated a non-deadly force unlawfully to a deadly force level. You're now the unlawful deadly force aggressor in that confrontation. That guy who shoved you would now be privileged to pull his own gun and shoot you dead if he reasonably perceives this thing in your hand to be a real gun, even if it's not actually a real gun, because it looks like a real gun and he's allowed to respond to reasonable appearances. By the way, maybe there's someone behind you not associated with either the man who shoved you or you, just observing events. He sees you get shoved. He knows you're allowed to use non-deadly force to defend yourself, but what you're not allowed to do is shoot the guy who shoved you. And he sees you pull out a gun, presenting as an unlawful deadly force threat to that other person, the man who shoved you. Well, what's that guy behind you entitled to do now? He's entitled to use deadly force in defense of others, in defense of the man who shot you, to protect innocent life from your apparent deadly force threat. And he can just shoot you in the back of the head in defense of others, apparent defense of others, and that would be a lawful use of force on his part. So you will have lost the privilege of self-defense, and because, or at least you would have appear to have exceeded your privilege of lawful self-defense by pulling out what appears to be a real gun, and now you can be subject to the use of deadly force lawfully by the person you're threatening and anybody else who happens to be around who's willing to engage in defense of others. That's not a position to put yourself in, folks. It's a remarkably stupid thing to do. So again, I don't tell people what to do. So if you want to buy this thing, that's up to you. But hopefully you're a bit more informed now about what some of the likely legal consequences are for choosing this particular tool for your use of force defensive needs.